Hello, and welcome to Your Art Sucks, a podcast dedicated to helping artists create better art. And this is episode 9, Path Followed, Thelonious Monk and Louis Bourgeois. In this episode, we will look at how being unyielding, loyal, and single-minded in the belief that the creative path you are on is the only path forward can bring about the recognition your work deserves, regardless of the amount of time it takes. Both artists in this episode will exemplify this idea and will serve as great examples to any artist who languishes in obscurity and questions their ability to keep moving forward. I know this will be a great episode due to the inspirational message that artists can be discovered and revered at any point in their career, even after decades of solid work that goes unnoticed or unaccepted. The impetus for this episode came to me while I was reading an article about the artist Lubaina Hamid. She is, at the time of this recording, the oldest artist to win the coveted, if at times controversial, Turner Prize. Lubaina is 63 years old. But this isn't a simple award provided to British visual artists based on their talent alone. From 1991 to 2016, it was won based on your age as well. You see, during these years, an artist had to be less than 50 years of age to qualify for consideration. So Lubaina was essentially excluded from winning, despite her obvious talent and years of consistent production. Luckily for her, though, this rule was removed in 2017, and she was finally able to get the recognition that eluded her for the majority of her career. But the moment was not lost on her. In conversation regarding the years she labored at her craft uncelebrated, to only have such recognition come to her so late in her career, she said this: "I think winning was bittersweet. I think to myself, what could I have done if I'd won it at age 40? That would have been good. But I guess there are more things I've got to say now, and it gives me a good opportunity to say them. There aren't that many years left. 20 years in front of you is not the same as 63 years behind you." While one could sense the bitterness in her words, such feelings are well within her right as an artist who dedicated her life to follow the creative path. She knew she had talent. She knew that her works were exposing truths still visible today. And she, I'm sure, believed that her gifts were worthy of exhibition in a place of prominence. So when praise did come for her at age 63, we can agree that those years prior may have left a slightly sour taste in her mouth. If we want to take a positive spin on this, as I try to normally do, I would point to the body of work that lay unrecognized that will now gain so much more exposure, and equally important, will most definitely spur so many young artists to greater heights. Now I want to talk to you about another artist, a pianist and a composer to be precise, who had fame fall on him only after a solid portion of his life was spent hidden in the multiple shadows. The shadow of fellow musicians who rapidly shot to success around him despite his immense talent. And unfortunately, the shadow of a mental illness that lay undiagnosed and untreated and tormented his life. I speak of Mr. Melodious, the high priest of bebop and one of the quintessential legends of jazz music, Mr. Thelonious Sphere Monk. Born in 1917 in Rocky Mount, North Carolina, Thelonious started teaching himself to play the piano at the early age of 6. And by 1922, his family had moved to New York City, to what was at the time known as San Juan Hill in Manhattan, due to all the former Spanish-American War veterans who lived there. San Juan Hill was the perfect place for Thelonious, as the neighborhood was alive with musical influences. And while music was a passion, school, on the other hand, wasn't. Thelonious did attend Stuyvesant High School, a public school for gifted students, but he didn't graduate. His first foray into playing for crowds came when he played church organ for a touring evangelist. But it was only in his late teens that he found his calling when he began to play jazz. And only a few short years later, he would be the house piano player at Minton's Playhouse, a Harlem nightclub. One thing you have to know about Minton's is that it was the birthplace of some of the greatest jazz music like bebop, which features songs characterized by fast tempo, complex chord progressions, and rapid chord changes, and numerous key changes, instrumental virtuosity, and almost vitally is the aspect of improvisation. Minton's had regular performances by Dizzy Gillespie, Charlie Parker, and in later years, Miles Davis, themselves legendary figures in the annals of this genre. So it was here that Thelonious cut his teeth amongst some of the greatest to ever play, and without a doubt, he held his own. Most who know the history of jazz would go so far as to say that the progression of this music wouldn't be what it became without Thelonious's early input. You see, Thelonious wasn't one to mirror other players. Sure, he was inspired by others like James Price Johnson, who, by the way, was absolutely instrumental in bridging ragtime with jazz through his compositions and his stride playing style on the piano. But Monk had his own thoughts about playing style, and at times, his ideas would come to clash with those he played with. He could be one stubborn and contentious man when the mood struck him, and he had little time for musicians who were only interested in imitation. Thelonious only respected those who constantly challenged themselves and pushed the boundaries of their instruments, as well as themselves personally. To do anything less, to him, was incomprehensible. But with this sometimes confrontational nature, other musicians steered clear of the tension and found more agreeable placement. Dizzy Gillespie, for one, found that his easygoing nature and his willingness to dazzle the audience was a better fit for the club, and Dizzy found fame early and quite easily. Thelonious, conversely, he refused to pander to the crowds, and instead he continued to push the limit. If they didn't understand what he was doing, he had no time for them. But with the hardline stance came the inability for him to pay his bills or rise above the house position he held for so long. White music critics at the time didn't understand Monk's incessant need to play slow and angular when all other jazz artists were playing fast and straightforward. Even Miles Davis would come to ask why was Thelonious so stubborn? And what's with his need to revisit the same group of notes over and over again, subtly changing chords that never made sense? It was infuriating to listen to. For Thelonious, though, every change he made, it made absolute sense to him. There were no wrong chords. They were the positive result of endless experimentation. And just like the audience, if Miles didn't get it, it was because he wasn't pushing himself hard enough. While Miles may not have got Monk's talent, there were others who saw the genius early on and wanted everyone to take notice. Guys like Hall Overton, an American composer and jazz musician, who was fortunate enough to work with Monk on the album The Thelonious Monk Orchestra at Town Hall in 1959. He said of Monk's playing style that he adjusted his finger pressure on the keys the way baseball pitchers do with the ball to make the path bend or curve or dip in flight. Tenor player Johnny Griffin said of Monk's music, "His music grew from nowhere else but from inside of him." Further to these men was one person who was a real champion for the cause, and she was Lorraine Gordon, who owned the Village Vanguard Club. There was an immediate connection to him the moment she heard him play. And it was from that moment that she spent her time as a tireless promoter of his work. With her husband's support, they decided to record his music on their label, Blue Note Records. So was this the beginning of Thelonious's career? Did fate bring these two together to let the world finally see the genius that was Monk? Well, no. The shadow, it just wouldn't be lifted yet. Even with the ample supply of records, it seems the shops in New York City, they weren't interested in selling anything he made. Lorraine remembers shop owners telling her they didn't want the records, and the people that came into their store, they didn't want to buy them. One owner told her bluntly, he said, "Lady, no one wants to buy a record from someone who sounds like he plays the piano with two left hands." The point was clear. Thelonious was playing on a different level, and it wasn't resonating with the general public. His work was complicated, with notes that hit the ear harshly at times. And speaking of harsh, boy, could he be difficult. He was too abrupt or seemingly ungrateful. Yeah, Thelonious wasn't a people person. He was absolutely someone who rubbed most people the wrong way. But there was a reason for this. A reason that had been there all along, but everybody failed to see. But as the years dragged on, in a career that failed to gain any momentum or provide any monetary relief, the episodes, as his family would come to know, they got steadily worse. He could be manic and conversely, he could be completely solemn and withdrawn to the point of being an absolute mute. For those who knew him, it was a type of silence so deafening, they did all they could to avoid just 1 second of it. With the support of his family, and his family was amazing supporters of his work, his wife, absolutely dedicated to him throughout their entire marriage. It's just incredible what Nellie did for him. But they did all they could. They subjected him and pushed him to see doctors. But the doctor's meager attempts to diagnose an unwilling patient, well, they failed miserably. The lithium they prescribed did nothing to combat the seemingly bipolar displays. The doctors even suggested electroshock therapy, but his family wouldn't allow it. But to his credit, Thelonious would continue to play through this ever-present shadow, and things would begin to turn around for him. But it wasn't through any singular, stellar performance or through a sudden change in public opinion. His fortunes would only reveal themselves through a painfully slow drip, drip, drip of gradual acceptance. It was as if a fog laid over a landscape of his music, and it began to burn off in the sunshine of his brilliance. After leaving Blue Note Records, he would be signed by Prestige, where he would cut some records that gained traction, albeit still underperforming by the levels of his contemporaries. A concert in Paris in 1954 also earned him some recognition, as the French appeared to be less stringent in their musical attitudes. By the late 50s, Monk had released a string of albums that continued to gain a following. And with the release of the album Brilliant Corners, most in the jazz world would finally see what was there all along, a talent far ahead of his time, who had now changed the very face of the genre and taken it to a new level of complexity and nuance no previous talent had. With Monk now in his late 30s, early 40s, the previous decades of experimentation were building to a crescendo that would come to a head in the 60s. During these years, he would sign with Columbia Records, one of the big 4 record companies at the time, and his work would now have more marketing and more promotion monies to back him. He would also travel to Europe to perform at sold-out shows. And with the release of Monk's Dream in 1963, Thelonious would have his most successful album to date. And while I would love to say that fame and success continued for him, and that his life was filled with the joy that came from his long overdue recognition, I sadly can't. As the euphoria of the 60s gave way to the 70s, the toll that Thelonious fought so hard to keep at bay finally had to be paid. He stopped playing gigs, and he retreated to the New Jersey home of one of his very close friends. Outside of family, few ever saw him again. His regression was so severe, the piano that was in that very apartment, the one he spent countless hours at, well, it remained untouched. He sadly died of a stroke on February 17th, 1982. Even after the passing of this legend, the world would continue to discover how special he was. And in 2006, he was awarded a special Pulitzer Prize for a body of distinguished and innovative musical composition that has had a significant and enduring impact on the evolution of jazz. How amazing is that? Before I move on to the next artist, I want to leave talking about Thelonious with a quote that sums up his beliefs and perfectly sums up the point of this episode. He said this. He said, "Play your own way. Don't play what the public want. You play what you want, and you let the public pick up on what you're doing, even if it does take them 15, 20 years." Now, there's something I would like you, dear listener, to do. There may be those of you who don't listen or who have never listened to jazz. I understand that. So I'm going to ask you to do one thing for me. I've put a link in the show notes to a performance on YouTube. I want you to find a quiet spot, put on some headphones, and allow yourself 7 minutes and 16 seconds of absolute brilliance. This performance of Thelonious Monk's song, Round Midnight, is one of the best covers I've ever heard. So do yourself a favor and go listen to it. If this performance doesn't change your mind about jazz, yeah, then no performance ever will. In the opening of this episode, I told you about Hamid and how the winning of the Turner Prize brought about a sudden change in her recognition. In that same vein, I want to now bring you the story of another female artist who also had one event bring an end to the 70-plus years of minuscule recognition, and that event was the unveiling of a 30-foot-tall sculpture of, as creepy as this is going to sound, a spider. Louise Bourgeois was born in 1911 in Paris, France. Her family ran a gallery that specialized in antique tapestries. But soon after, they moved a short distance outside of the city to begin a business of restoring tapestries that were damaged or worn. Louise would work for her parents in helping them bring these works of art back to their former glory. While the business was doing well, and the family appeared, on the surface, to be quite loving, Louise's father had a side to him that caused everyone serious pain. It seems that her father, well, he was a serial philanderer, and he did little to hide it. While her mother knew of the indiscretions, she chose to keep her family together and ignore the acts. But Louise would internalize her hatred for this cheating and the impact it had on her ever-patient and loving mother. With her father's ever self-serving rules and the incessant need to discredit her, Louise found solace in schooling when she studied mathematics at the Sorbonne. She stated this: "I got peace of mind only through the study of rules nobody could change." But with the death of her mother in 1932, Louise decided that she would no longer deny herself the path she felt was her true course of life, and she began studying painting and printmaking immediately. As he did most of her life, her father disapproved of art and her practicing it. Undeterred, she was able to attend schooling for free when she took up as a student translator for English-speaking students who attended the French school. And it was here that her artistic direction would have its first course correction. Upon seeing her paintings, the famous French Cubist painter Fernand Léger, he would state that painting wasn't for her, but it was in sculpture that her true talent lay. And in the mid-1930s, Louise would have another discovery that would eventually come to mark her work indelibly. She made a connection to her deep-seated pain from her father's infidelity and her mother's ability to remain an ever-present source of maternal love. While it was a match that would supply her with decades of originality and consistent production, it failed to push her name into the mouths of those who ran galleries. With no financial resources to pull from, Louise returned to a world that made sense to her father. Opening up a print shop next to her father's gallery in Paris, she was supported by him, as this was the type of work that aligned with his controlling notions of what her life should be. Fortunately, several positive things came out of this. One, Louise never stopped working during this time. The second thing was meeting her eventual husband and father to her 3 children, American art historian Robert Goldwater. It was with Robert that Louise would leave France and emigrate to the U.S. to live in New York City. While she would take up painting again and still continue to study under other artists, there was no progression. For Bourgeois, the early 1940s represented the difficulties of a transition to a new country and the struggle to enter the exhibition world of New York City. Her work during this time was constructed from junkyard scraps and driftwood, which she used to carve upright wood sculptures. But the themes of the abuse she endured in her childhood were still readily available to her, and slowly she developed a more artistic confidence. Although her middle years were more opaque, which might be due to the fact that she received very little attention from the outside art world. Outside of a single show in 1945 at the Peridot Gallery, which represented some painting and sculpture, there was nothing to help propel her work into the mainstream art conversations at the time. Like Thelonious, people had commented that they found Louise to be gruff in nature and in conversation. Could Louise be yet another situation where the public and her peers just couldn't see the elevated work right in front of their faces? Well, in another similarity to Thelonious, Louise had someone who did see the potential of her work early on. At this time, she befriended a group of artists that included William de Kooning, Mark Rothko, and Jackson Pollock. As part of the American Abstract Artists Group, Bourgeois made the transition from wood and upright structure to marble, plaster, and bronze as she investigated concerns like fear, vulnerability, and loss of control. This transition was an absolute turning point. She referred to her early work as the fear of falling, which later transformed into the art of falling, and the final evolution as the art of hanging in there. Her conflicts in real life empowered her to authenticate her experiences and struggles through a unique art form. Without intention, the 60s saw Louise become a figure in the feminist movement. Her ability to remove the stigmas regarding female sexuality and the female form, as well as her unique take on materials, for example using hard substances normally associated with male physique to depict female shapes, was empowering to those who viewed her work. The 60s also saw many trips to Italy, where Louise would create dozens of marble pieces over several years. Again, all of this experimentation was under the radar and without much critical fanfare, so there were no limitations on what type of art she should be creating. There was no ever-changing rules in regards to where she had been as an artist and where she was going. It was her call alone to produce in whatever medium she wished. As time moved into the 70s, more transitions occurred in her life, but not all were positive. In 1973, her husband Robert sadly passed away. The incident impacted her, and as with the passing of her mother, Louise was once again ready to change. Taking up teaching positions with institutions like Yale and Columbia, she influenced many artists with her well-honed artistic processes. The students gained so much from her ability to pull the emotional elements out of their heads and put them into their works. While some would see teaching as an escape for artists who didn't have the talent to make it in the real world, Louise was the exception. By the mid-1970s, with shifts in the art world trends, her reputation was steadily growing. Although she had been given only 4 one-woman shows in 30 years after her debut as a sculptor in 1949, from 1978 to 1981, she had 5 in New York alone. But if we add the years as a painter, which started in 1932, we're now coming up to close to 50 years of her tireless efforts to reach the masses. Seriously daunting to consider that one would have to wait almost a lifetime to see some success. But it's also equally inspiring to know that the path leads to such ends, in spite of the length of the journey. After multiple retrospectives of her work in 1982 and 1989, her reputation was becoming fixed in the art world. Like the shift in views Thelonious' music had on its listeners, who eventually came around to his genius, Louise's work also spoke to more and more viewers who found it equally challenging and nurturing. When Louise created her giant spider sculpture, titled Maman, while not her first production of arachnids, the public were overwhelmingly engaged in the piece. There was no way you couldn't be impacted by this large and easily recognizable creature that, for most, invokes fear and disgust. But as with her earlier pieces that challenged long-held views of femininity, the spider, for her, contained no negativity. About this piece she said, "The spider is an ode to my mother. She was my best friend. Like a spider, my mother was a weaver. My family was in the business of tapestry restoration, and my mother was in charge of the workshop. Like spiders, my mother was very clever. Spiders are friendly presences that eat mosquitoes. We know that mosquitoes spread diseases and are therefore unwanted. So spiders are helpful and protective, just like my mother." While this rationale may be lost on most casual viewers, the sculpture is undoubtedly a highly engaging and photographed work. While I would never say this piece has been called a selfie magnet. Was that Louise's goal? Well, that's doubtful. But it does spark conversation, and that's more aligned with the purpose of the piece. Public recognition aside, Louise continued to be productive well into her later stages of life. She lived to see her work purchased by the Tate Modern and the National Gallery of Canada. She witnessed her rise from obscurity to be a leading figure in the world of sculpture. She was named Officer of the Order of Arts and Letters by the French Minister of Culture in 1983. Other honors came from the French government in 1991. The National Medal of Arts, presented to her by President Bill Clinton in 1997, the first Lifetime Achievement Award from the International Sculpture Center in Washington, and election as a Fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. It was evident that the later years of her career were overflowing with accolades, and rightly so. With over 60 years of life as an artist, Louise passed away in 2010 at the age of 98. And it must be noted that she had just finished another sculpture a week before her passing. I mean, how brilliant is that? To be able to continue working so long into a career. So as we have heard with the lives of both Thelonious and Louise, the pursuit of art is one that requires complete commitment. We've heard the struggles they endured to shape their voice, to give it form, and to push the conventional thinkers outside their comfort zone. They faced many who believed their talent was limited and without merit, but such derision did little to change the paths they tread. Both artists were firm in their belief that they had substance and value, and they both worked tirelessly to hone their work without the categorizing that comes with early fame and traps the artists for the rest of their lives into producing nothing more than what brought them initial success. Their obscurity, as well as their contentious or grumpy personalities, kept the world at bay until such a time that their work was ready for the weight of critical scorn. 30 years of experimentation combined with steadfast resolve creates a strong barrier to the general cynicism and those who are quick to call such art depthless or ill-conceived. Few artists can boast decades of uninterrupted focus to their craft. If the 10,000-hour rule is to be believed, then both of these artists have paid their share and the share of many others. If either one of these artists had immediate success, would they have become the legends that they are known to be? It's a really tough question to answer. Either way, we know the path of an artist is one that is far from routine. One can never know when the world will come around to recognize what's always been there. But what does this mean for you as an artist? Well, we know the point of this episode was to show you that success can come for you at any stage of your career, even if that means that you have to work your ass off for 40 years before it comes. So if you're contemplating your artistic path and whether or not it's worth continuing, I would say to you that such talk can be a double-edged sword. On one hand, it can allow you to reaffirm your decision and allow you to attack your work with a new sense of commitment. On the other hand, it can be a destructive force that eats away at your confidence and drives a wedge between your soul's calling and the reality of life. At the end of the day, there is no right decision that I can tell you to take. Each of us must come to that on our own. But never allow a lack of recognition or fame or sales to be a single deterrent to following art as a career. Who knows how your path will flow? But if you're not standing firmly on it and not working every day to put one step in front of the other, you will entirely remove yourself from any opportunity for such success to find you. It may take a year, 10 years, 30 years, but you need to be ready for it when it comes. Now, before I wrap up, I do want to leave you with some words of wisdom from Louise herself. She was gracious enough to pass on her knowledge on what it takes to be a successful artist, and I'm going to pass them on to you for your consideration. She listed 4 lessons as absolutely critical, and here they are. Lesson 1. Make art about your life. Thelonious made his music that came solely from inside of him, and Louise used her early trauma as the main impetus for her work. Lesson 2. Find inspiration in all of nature. Now, Louise did add to this. She said that includes spiders and maggots. And so be open, be non-judgmental, and free in thought. Lesson 3. Revisit the same theme over and over, but keep experimenting with it. Now, interestingly, this is also very similar to what Thelonious said. He was well known for playing the same chords over and over with only slight changes each time. He wholly believed that nothing was ever finished evolving. And finally, lesson 4, and the most important lesson that can be conveyed in this or any episode, and that is, never stop making art. Well, there you have it. I do hope that this episode helped you in your pursuits. I really want you to be inspired by both these artists and the many others who never achieved fame in their lifetimes. Whatever you're doing, whatever you're working on, just stick with it. No matter what. Keep working at it, keep chipping away at the truth, and eventually, something good will happen. Now stop listening to me and go rededicate yourself to following the artistic path you're on. You owe it to yourself and the world. Thank you.